Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to Cambodia Global Dialogue of Southeast Asia TV. Tonight we have a great pleasure and honor to have with us the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, that everybody knows as the WTO, Madame Valentine Rugwabiza. Valentine, welcome to the show.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes. The context is quite interesting. She happened to be in the region and she decided to fly to Cambodia, and so she will meet with the Prime Minister and have a good discussion on what's happening in Cambodia in the context of our accession to WTO 6 years ago. And as a matter of fact, we just recently complete the first trade policy review in Geneva, and I was told by friends in Geneva that it went very well. So I think in this context, I'm so glad to have Valentine, an old friend of mine, a former colleague in Geneva, together to Cambodia. So Valentine, once again, welcome to Cambodia, and welcome to the show. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Siphana. I'm delighted to be in Cambodia. As you know, Cambodia was the first least developed country to accede to the World Trade Organization since it became the World Trade Organization in 1995. Cambodia acceded in 2004.
Yes.
So Cambodia has a particular meaning for the World Trade Organization and for all its members.
Yes.
So very delighted to be with you.
Yeah. Well, Valentine, before we start a dialogue, perhaps you should say a bit about yourselves for the audience and a bit about the institution. Because a lot of people know about it, but there's a lot of myth also about the institution. Yeah.
Well, about myself, very briefly.
Yes,
Very briefly, I joined the WTO. I've been the Deputy Director General at the World Trade Organization since 2005. Yeah. But I was involved in trade issues before that. I was the ambassador of Rwanda to WTO.
Yes.
And to the UN in Geneva for 3 years before that. Yeah. So I come from myself from Rwanda,
yes,
from a least developed countries.
Yes.
So I am personally very sensitive to issues faced by least developed countries, which are issues that are close
yes,
to my own country.
Yeah. Well, Cambodia, like you say, was the first LDC who have joined the WTO, and I would say 6 years later, now that you're in town, you see what's happening in the country, I would say we did very well. And we are really looking forward for, further economic integration, this time at the regional level. What, in retrospect, because you've been in Cambodia for several times in many Aid for Trade conference with the Asian Development Bank, with the WTO, what is your impression for this trip?
Well, I've just arrived, so
yes,
I can't give you much of an impression
yes, yes,
right now. I will be able, after having spent at least a minimum of 24 hours. But clearly, yeah, my impression looking back,
yes,
a few years back since Cambodia joined,
yes,
there is no doubt,
yeah,
from our perspective and from the trade perspective, that Cambodia has really progressed, yes, tremendously. Yeah. What the WTO accession brought to Cambodia, it was an encore of a number of legal reforms, a number of legislative reforms that needed to be put in place, yes, to just be a little bit more friendly to businesses.
Yeah. And
that has happened. That has happened not only on paper, but clearly because we saw the numbers, yes, in terms of exports of Cambodia booming, and an average growth of 10% per annum.
Yes.
So that is quite impressive. During the 6 years Cambodia has been a member of WTO,
yeah,
well, almost a doubling, yes, of per person revenue.
Yes.
So it is those are not only numbers. Those numbers have a meaning if they can be translated in better living for people.
Yes.
And there is as well a poverty reduction that is happening in Cambodia. So those numbers mean something if they change the lives of people. And this is happening. But having said that, more to be done. Even regarding WTO accession commitment, lot of progress, but what is coming clearly from this trade policy review, WTO members praised Cambodia, and the delegation that was led by Senior Minister Cham, member praised really Cambodia, but emphasized as well that a little bit more work to be done on few of the accession commitments.
Well, you know, when we negotiate Cambodia accession WTO, you know, as a least developed country, it was not easy, I must say. You know, because legal reform is not easy, you know, institutional reform is not easy. In a post-conflict country, you mentioned you're from Rwanda, Cambodia went through similar difficult years, starting from scratch. But I say it's that a commitment to openness that sometimes, you know, we sort of take for granted now. You know, and it is when we start seeing the global economic crisis, we start realizing, my God, I mean, other countries are sort of like resorting to protection measure, you know. But for us, we know what it is to be closed. And that's why even, you know, during the economic crisis, right after the economic crisis, we say, look, closing up again is not the option. It's really pushing forward and looking what are the angle, and that's why we push for new source of growth. For example, you know, the agricultural sector is a clear example. You know, and I would say here, the aid for trade has been quite a big support, a big boost in terms of policy stimulation, in terms of injection of knowledge, know-how, and even capital from many donors. The WTO have played a big role in the aid for trade. I mean.
Absolutely, and just before getting to that, one point you mentioned, trade opening. Trade opening has served Cambodia very well.
Yes.
And I think that's part of, that's what fuel your current commitment, your continuous commitment to trade opening. Now, trade is very much the foundation of Cambodia development strategy.
It's clear.
And when you read, well, more than 60% of your GDP depend on trade, so it is your foundation now. For Cambodia, it's clear that it is important. The mission that WTO has is vital. You need other countries to remain open. You need other borders to remain open. So it is clear that you cannot close your own borders and expect other countries' borders to remain open. I have to say, though, you just mentioned the crisis in 2008, and a major impact we see of the crisis, at least trade policy-wise, is that a number of countries are really reacting they're just reverting inward, which is to be expected. When things are tough, everybody tends to look for a shelter. And when things are tough, some will say, well, let's close our borders because we need the few jobs that we have, we need to keep them at home. And the little food that we have, well, now that the prices are going up, the little food that we have, we need to hold it. Cambodia didn't do that. And you deserve praise for that as well. On the contrary, the response was very much to invest more in infrastructure. The response was very much to invest a little more in education. So that forward-looking response, that is something that allows Cambodia to really cross that difficult year of 2009 and as of 2010 already to resume again growth. And I think I'm mentioning this because that has been an inspiration to a number of other countries, including countries that are wealthier, much wealthier than Cambodia.
Yeah.
And I think the example you're giving here is that, well, first of all, trade opening itself you well, but also trade protectionism is now it is a self-defeating strategy.
Yes, you know, I have to say that, you know, next year is a very important year for Cambodia, as you know, Cambodia will be chairing the ASEAN, and it's interesting that you know, when you enter the WTO, people sort of like forget about it, right? 2004, 5, 6, people are happy. Then, you know, sort of like people sort of like, okay, take for granted. But then it's interesting because all along there's a lot of work in the regional, you know, ASEAN free trade with China, with Australia, India, New Zealand, ASEAN dialogue with the US. Then the ASEAN Secretariat is doing a major study to figure out by the year 2015, when we become an ASEAN economic community, what country will be ready, you know, to be part of the economic community. And it's amazing that Cambodia ranked number 3 after Singapore and Malaysia. And the analysis is clear, say that it was the work, it was a leftover. You know, it's not necessarily the work we did as part of the ASEAN integration, but it was the commitment of the liberalization commitment that we made in WTO that keep carrying on forward. And then the ASEAN just pick up to say, great, since you open a WTO already, you know, it shouldn't be any problem. You don't have to make much more effort. So these are the things that I find is a major sort of like a reinforcing message, that what happened 6 years ago in different global contexts find its relevancy, if not its potency, in the regional dynamics here. So you mentioned the not closing. I would use the other word, which is that ASEAN use a lot now, is ASEAN connectivity. You know, there's a lot of growth corridor and everything. And the work that the WTO is even though the trade round is not coming to a conclusion yet, but we find a lot of work, the discussion on trade facilitation, for example, find its way. The technical dimension, the discussion, find its way in the regional context. You know, the e-commerce, that sort of thing. And we, at the regional level, we pick up those things and we try to push ASEAN single window for custom automation, for example. So I see a clear linkage between what's happening at the global level, the multilateral level, and the regional level. What's your take on the synergy between these two?
They could, and ASEAN is a very good example of a possible complementarity between regional integration and global trade integration.
Yes.
Regional integration, if regional integration is truly covering, has a large coverage of trade, both in goods and services, then it could complement trade, what we're trying to achieve through the multilateral negotiations and tools. But then it needs to be ambitious as well.
Okay.
You do have a number of other regional trade agreements or preferential agreements that in reality are not preferential at all, because they cover very little trade. Or they divert trade more than, they discriminate against other members more than they really add to integration, to trade integration. So on that front, I would say on that particular subject that it depends on the way trade integration is conducted, and so far ASEAN has done a good job. Now, next year, as Cambodia takes up the chairmanship of ASEAN, I think it will be an opportunity for Cambodia to also bring to all members, all ASEAN members, the different challenges
yes.
The countries are confronted with in this region.
Yes, yes.
This is the region that is leading global growth, but nevertheless, this is also the region that is home to a number of countries, of economies that have still huge capacity issues. And you mentioned aid for trade. Now, the potential is there, but some of the infrastructural, some of the constraints that are existing in those economies can really be removed.
I see. Give me some example on that one.
They could be removed. You mentioned trade. You mentioned trade facilitation. Well, you have managed in Cambodia through the single window to really, in a very important manner, to just reduce the time it takes for your exports. But I do believe that there is still progress that could be done even on that front. You can still reduce the number of days that really you exports take today, and that will clearly add. So those are issues that are less related to the policy, because the policy of the government is not questionable here, but they are linked to capacity, logistics. Are the logistics there that will really allow to speed up just the processing of goods? So that is one example that will have a tremendous impact.
You know, if I just take one of the new success story that Cambodia has, which is the rice story, where before with a lot of, I would say, it started a lot from the early IF, you know, then the enhanced IF, integrated framework, and then the large aid for trade. We see a lot of ad hoc support into the sector, but it's really after the economic crisis that the government realized, my God, we have to look at this as a major source of growth, and that's why we mobilize a lot of support to help us to think through the various sort of like a barrier to develop the sector. And you know, before we had the rice policy, we barely export 15,000 metric tons in 2009. Last year, in the middle, when the policy was launched mid-year, by the end of 2010, we have about 50,000 tons of export. This year, before the flood, we're up already to 100,000 metric tons. But the interesting, you mentioned logistics, because when we have a lot of discussion with the private sector, we find out that there is no way, if the government set our aim to have 1 million tons by 2015, which is the year we enter the ASEAN Economic Community, there is no way we can export 1 million tons logistically, not production. Logistically, on container, on traditional mode of conventional transport, we have to look at different other way, you know, like bulk, break bulk, you know, by barge. But all this relate a lot to trade facilitation issue. In this case, with our neighboring country, for example, as we start to use the river, the Mekong River to Vietnam, and using Vietnam as a international gateway, for example. So the work on trade facilitation, I find, has a lot of importance for the country. And we see, for example, that the custom is leading. Our custom, I would say, they need to be praised, because in every country, custom is not an easy agency to work with, right? But in this country, we see that they have contributed to the reduction of sort of like the cost of doing business. You know, before we have the policy, it's about over $1,000 per container, the cost, right? You know, I would say now is the reduction is almost nearly 50%, the transaction cost that came down as a result of this rice export policy. So trade facilitation is clear. We are not competitive versus our neighbor Vietnam because of trade facilitation. See?
And you mentioned it all. It's still because it's still very expensive.
Yes.
It is still very expensive to do business.
Yes.
In Cambodia.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that points to what should be the priorities, the current priorities. Yes. What are the current priorities, and which the government is already tackling? Now, it is also interesting to see how Cambodia rebounded very quickly in response to the crisis.
Yes.
I would say, though the crisis had huge costs, but one positive element of this crisis is that it added, in the case of Cambodia, it added urgency to the need to diversify.
Yes, yes.
There was a clear need to diversify the economy, but then it was no longer something that could have been postponed for a couple of years.
Exactly.
So it became very urgent to just to diversify, not only the exports and the kind of the different sectors. You mentioned the rice, because one of the most successful success story for Cambodia, but also to diversify market.
Yes.
The moment the traditional and the main market of Cambodia went through this economic downturn, it became very it became evident that there was a need to really look closer at other Asian markets. There was absolutely there was urgency. This is not to say that overnight or in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, the first market of Cambodia will no longer be the first market of Cambodia. It will remain. It will remain. But in order to reduce its vulnerability to external shocks, Cambodia needs to diversify its export market as well. And the potential is there in the region. You have a savoir-faire. What is the problem? The problem today is very much the cost of doing business in this country, which is still very expensive.
I concur with you wholeheartedly. So we make progress, but we still have work to do. If we are to become, I hope, the paradigm shift, the mindset is that when we finish our chairmanship in 2012, we should be in position to say we're not anymore a post-crisis country. We're a normal country, a country that should think competitiveness, not think aid, not think pity, not think help, but think of a country that would want to earn its merit, right? So, but Valentine, since you're coming from Geneva, I cannot avoid to ask you to say a bit what's happening in Geneva, particularly next month. I understand the ministerial is taking place.
Absolutely. Next month, our ministerial will take place from the 14th of December. As you know, every 2 years, we organize a ministerial. The ministers come together to basically check on how the organization is doing. Now, this covers the full spectrum of the organization activities, and not only what is well known by everybody, meaning the negotiations. And I will say a few words on the Doha Development Agenda, what ministers are at least expected to do with regard to the Doha Development Agenda. But I would like to start, first of all, by other key functions of the organization. And one of the key functions of the organization that has really proven to be very, I will say, very helpful to members, but also to have served members very well, it is the transparency function. To have served them well during this time of crisis. And in which way? Simply because we monitor on a very regular basis the kind of trade restrictive measures that some members are putting in place in just reaction
as you mentioned
to the
earlier,
current environment. So that, I will say, the picture that we're getting very recently, it is not yet a situation that is alarming, but it is nevertheless a reason for worry. And why I'm saying it is a reason for worry is that today there is a kind of a cumulative effect of these different measures. The measures that were adopted by members just in the aftermath of the crisis, very few of them have been removed. To the extent that, and that I'm speaking of the 20 major economies only.
Yes, yes.
We focus our monitoring on the 20 major economies. And very few have been removed, but in addition to that, few additional measures are being added. Absolutely. Yeah. So it is, today it is affecting a little bit more than 2% of global trade, which becomes something to consider seriously. The good news in that is that, as you know, the G20 summit just took place in Cannes. The leaders just met in Cannes, and they have restated their commitment. They have renewed the commitment to fight protectionism, and they accepted a commitment for a standstill, at least to remove some of the measures, but a standstill, not enact new trade restrictive measures between now and 2013. So that is encouraging, that's and positive. We have contributed a lot to that by just providing a check, a check regularly. Now, you will agree with me that that's great to check, but it is not enough. The most efficient way of really preventing and protecting against protectionism will be to have stronger and tighter disciplines. And that can only be achieved through the negotiations.
Yes, indeed.
Because in the negotiations, as you know, we will be, through the negotiation, when concluded, we should be able to have tighter rules. We should be able to reduce the margin that countries have to revert, to just sometimes increase the tariffs and so on and forth. One point I will make here also is that the restrictive measures that we have seen more recently are not necessarily targeting border measures. We are increasingly seeing non-tariff measures, behind-the-border measures, and some of those measures that really are don't apply at the borders. Some of those measures are much more difficult to monitor, simply because the disciplines are loose when it comes to some of these measures. So clearly, I'm making this point to emphasize again the need for the organization to continue to update the rules, to upgrade the rules so that they will correspond to the realities of trade practices today. And that, the Doha Development Agenda, but the Doha Development Agenda we are currently, the reality is that it has reached an impasse. Our expectation out of next month ministerial is that the ministers will provide guidance on new approaches. What is the impasse that is there? It is not a problem, it is not a dissension. What is at the origin of the impasse, it is not a dissension about what issues should be negotiated, but rather on what should be the level of ambition, who should do what. And clearly today there is a difference in the understanding between the understanding of developed countries and emerging economies about what each other should do.
Valentine, you know, for next year, Cambodia as chair, our Prime Minister will have the honor to be invited to address the G20 in Mexico. So for sure, we will be making a strong position stance on behalf of ASEAN to support the Doha Development Agenda. That is clear. You know, so this is something that we feel that our region, you know, as one of the driver of economic recovery, of growth, we should be assertive in supporting the global agenda. So we're coming to the end of the program. Your last word.
Well, my last word is that, first of all, to thank you and to thank Cambodia for the leadership that Cambodia has taken, not only on least developed countries, but very much on developing countries. And you mentioned that next year, as a chairman of the ASEAN, you will be in all these important global fora. It is an absolute mass, I think it is essential that a country like Cambodia, for whom trade as simply is the anchor of its development, make the case to the global leaders why it is important to maintain trade open for Cambodia development. That is more efficient than any kind of aid program. That Cambodia has the potential to develop itself. Cambodia has the potential to participate to other nation development as well, provided they play by the rules, provided they put in place transparent multilateral rules.
Thanks, Valentine. I think, as always, 30 minutes is very short. We barely get started and at the end. But let me just say on behalf of the audience, the Cambodian audience and the studio, also thank you for taking your precious time to come and share with us your perspective, you know, on our own country development, but also some of the expectation that you see from Cambodia as a least developed country, but foremost as a country who have believed and still believe in economic liberalization. So the message is clear that at least there's one strong message I retain from this, is that, you know, protectionism is not the answer. We should further the eye-opening and continue to play this leadership role. So once again, Valentine, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It has been truly a pleasure.
Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the end of the program, unfortunately, and I hope you learned something from this short discussion. It's a little bit difficult for those who are not into trade, into global issue, but for sure, a simplistic message to the Cambodian crowd is that, you know, Cambodia for the last 6 years have benefited from economic liberalization. Our leadership, the Prime Minister, is a fervent supporter of economic opening, economic liberalization, and I think it is through this particular, you know, political drive that Cambodia is enjoying its prosperity, and we're just happy to have as one organization that has been so supportive of Cambodia effort, you know, which is the World Trade Organization, and I just cannot thank enough the Deputy Director General, Valentine, a good friend of mine, who take the time to come and share with us. So I see you next week. Good night.